Hello, perhaps you or someone you know have been involved with a very serious accident, an act of violence, and in the moment of the terror and the crisis, you needed someone for support. Maybe the police officer was busy, or the firefighters and paramedics were too busy to really talk to you. Well, today we'll find out those people who appear on the scene in crisis counseling times with Austin Police Department's Victim Services. So please stay with us.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, my name is Shane Whistler, your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And with us today are two representatives, and we'll have two more in the break, from the Victim Services Unit of the Austin Police Department. And we have Ann Hutchison, who organized this unit 18 years ago, and now you're the Director of Victim Services, and Kimberly Ericus, who is a supervisor with the crisis teams, and we will explain those titles as we go along. I think a lot of people do not know what kind of services Austin has, and particularly this unit attached with the Austin Police Department called Victim Services. Can you give us, before you tell us how it started with you, can you give us the brief overview of the four areas that Victim Services cover? Just name them, and then we'll go back to hear how it started, and then go into individual units.
Great. We've got, of course, a crisis team. You just mentioned we have a major crimes unit. We have a children's services unit, and we have a emergency outreach to families and neighborhood unit.
Okay, so within just Victim Services, there are four areas of specialization.
Right.
And these are to aid people that have found themselves either victims or in accidents, and they're survived something traumatic.
Yes, absolutely.
And Ann, I know you were the instrumental push in getting this program started. What happened in your life to lead you to that point?
This is a really special story to me. Back in 1977, 78, I was called into a meeting at the Austin Child Guidance Center where I was a counselor for children who were being sexually abused, to meet with two law enforcement officers, a Sergeant Doyne Bailey and a Sergeant Don Martin. And what they had to propose to our agency was asking us to come help take statements from the young children who had been sexually or severely physically abused. And I was so touched that the police department would actively outreach and seek help to help the children, because they were really afraid of traumatizing them. And I was already working with the hospitals and doing outreach, but this was like kind of that final piece of saying to us, we need your help and let's start working together. I think there's been a long history between mental health and law enforcement that was like oil and water. And this was really the other side actually reaching out to us. And so that relationship began, and it was very fruitful, and it grew. And so when a grant came open back in 1980, even though I wasn't trained in all the other types, such as homicide and fatalities, the concepts, the universal trauma and impact was there for all that suffer from crime. And so it seemed like a natural segue to a calling to get involved.
Mm-hmm. What, 18 years sounds like a long time, especially if we're talking about crisis.
Right.
What are from you apparently being the first staff person, so to speak, and how many now today work professionally for Victim Services in some way?
We're very lucky, including all our grants, and there are a number of grants and temporaries. We have 29 employees. We have 18 of our own that are city employees, and then the others are on different grants, particularly in the area of family violence and emergency outreach on crisis teams and to families.
And could you again list the four areas, and then we'll
Sure.
touch base on crisis team.
We have our major crimes unit, which is actually in the investigation unit. Once a crime happens on the street, the case is then given to a detective, and we have counselors who work with homicide, assault, child abuse, family violence, and sex crimes, and that's our major crimes unit. Then we have a partnership that's just happened between our family protection team and our child protection team, which is a wonderful marriage of those two units to start working not only with children who are abused, but family violence and the victims, and to acknowledge that those are children in the homes. Mm-hmm. Then we have emergency outreach services to children on the street, and what's called the District Representative Program, which is phenomenally popular already in Edwards sector, and our chief is looking at putting that in all sectors of the city because it is so supportive of neighborhoods in which we have counselors paired up with officers to do work, extensive support and follow-up on repeat homes that are having problems. And then our final one, which Kim runs, is our crisis team. And it's in some ways one of our best known, but it's also one of our best kept secrets.
Great, great. Kimberly, I'm glad you're here, and you're a supervisor with the crisis teams. And how many supervisors are there?
We have 4 supervisors.
4 supervisors, and so about how many teams does that represent overall?
We have a supervisor for each unit within victim services, and within crisis team, which is what I supervise, gosh, I want to say we have 7 people in that unit right now. However, all the victim services is cross-trained to be able to work in any other unit. So the other 3 units also take a shift in our crisis team.
Well, to help our viewers get oriented, Ann had mentioned Edwards sector, which is the name of one of the sectors of the city. The police department
Right.
covers the city of Austin in 6 sectors, and Edward is the northeast area of the city. And that means you see the officers, their police cars, there's an E on there, that's Edward sector, and usually they're in the northeast area of town. Well, crisis teams, I know, have their own cars, or
Right.
one car at a time, with the counselor and a volunteer, and are driving around the whole city, or maybe have to specialize in a certain area.
That's correct.
So what does that look like what does a crisis team look like? Who's in it? What do
Good.
they do?
Let me backtrack a moment. The crisis team is the group of counselors who do on-the-scene crisis intervention. And ideally, we take a team leader. It could be a staff member, or it could be a volunteer who's had specialized training with us, who actually takes the team out. Ideally, it's a team leader and a volunteer who go out into the city. The crisis team does cover the entire city, though we try and divide it into certain sectors. One team works the south sector, one works central, and one works north. And they do have the police cars with the police radios and the police computers, and they drive the city listening for calls from officers asking them to come assist victims on scenes.
These are unmarked cars, and I want to backtrack even farther. We are civilians.
That's a good
We
point.
are chickens, basically.
I wouldn't say that, but
But
it's important to make that distinction.
Right. We're mental health professionals, and so
Right.
that's where we are, and we consider ourselves really a team with our law enforcement officer to continue the work that he first starts in trying to comfort and normalize a bit this trauma.
And you're now a supervisor, but you don't
That's
start
correct.
out being a supervisor. What in your life, Kimberly, led you to entering this field and this profession?
Oh gosh, entering this field, that's a whole nother story and a whole nother show.
What was your college education?
I have my undergraduate degree in psychology and my master's in social work. And I received my master's here in Austin and decided to stay on and worked within the field for quite a while, and started with victim services a good 2.5 years ago as a counselor in the family violence unit. And sometime after that moved into a supervisory position that actually supervised a family violence outreach unit, which is part of what you had heard earlier, the district representative program. And about 8 months ago or so, I'd say, I moved over into the crisis team supervisor position, and I love the crisis team. It's a bit of everything, and that works really well for me. Allows a lot of flexibility.
Right. Well, what have been some feedback you've gotten either from, this question for both of you, from police officers, administration, and from the the people you've helped on the scenes?
I think I can give a perspective of the beginning and knowing how well we are received by our department. We have a 98% approval and usefulness rating from our officers, and you can't beat that. I will say back in 1981, March of 81, when we first started the team, there was a lot of skepticism, and I think that's healthy. I mean, who is this civilian coming out, getting involved in our cases? What are you going to do? And there were some funny times of cases they set up or different scenarios. But I think what we both learned is an incredible respect for each other. They taught me how caring and compassionate our law enforcement officers are, and I hopefully began the process that Kim and all the other counselors continue on, and the volunteers, of how much care and compassion there is for assisting our officers and really trying to impact the quality of life in Austin for both our own neighbors as well as any community, part of our community.
Right.
My feeling is that officers are extremely empathetic. They have a lot of caring, a lot of need to assist the victims who have just gone through whatever situation it is, whether it was a victim of crime, or a victim of trauma, and that they really want to do everything they can to assist them, and we are a vehicle to help them do that. So I sense their appreciation through allowing us to help the victim in that situation. I'd say that the feedback is very positive, both from victims on the scene as well as the officers who we encounter every day, who we work with.
Good, and that's saying a lot. I know we just have a few more moments in this segment, and we're going to have a volunteer as well as a crisis team leader, a counselor with us. But the name of this program is Austin Faith Dialogue, and I see spirituality in every aspect of life, but some people don't. How could this relate to faith, and what do you hope to do in the future?
And I'd like to give a plug for Metro Ministries, how often I've worked with them over the years, and the real activism. And I think that relationship needs to grow even more, because there's no question there's a spiritual crisis for those that become victims, or that their loved one is a victim of crime, and that relationship can only get stronger and better. And I guess it's a calling that I put out to call and volunteer for victim services, and for us to join together in training in all the different faiths in Austin to work together. Because we not only see ourselves now working with victims and families, we've really expanded what the family looks like. And that's the neighborhood, the school, the co-workers in the businesses. Truly a community justice concept of healing. And it does invoke the need for the emotional, psychological, and spiritual part of all of us that must be healed.
That's great. So you would even ask clergy to volunteer to come forward and learn how to interact with
Right.
crisis counseling. Clergy do a lot of counseling, and
Right.
all other faith leaders, because Austin Metropolitan Ministries represents all
Right.
spiritual groups.
Right.
So,
And I think that that's important for people to understand, that trauma counseling and crisis counseling is unique. It is different than typical mental health work and even pastoral counseling.
That's right.
Even though they touch on each other and borrow from each other, there is something unique about it, and the training is a special part that we offer.
good. Well, thank you both very much for the work you do and for being here to share it. And we're going to get two more partners
Thank
of
you,
yours
Shane.
in the next segment. So please stay with us on this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue, where we talked about victim services and helping others in crisis. Hello, my name is Shane Whistler, your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. We thank you for staying with us and joining a very special program talking about how the Austin Police Department's special civilian unit called Victim Services helps people in crisis, immediate crisis on the scene. And we have two people that are very familiar with that. I want to welcome Amy Curiel, who's a counselor on staff with Victim Services, and you serve as a crisis team leader on patrol, so to speak, although you're not police, and also John Daly, a volunteer with the program. And I know the volunteers have to go through a very long training session and ride with a police officer for a 10-hour shift and with Victim Services for a shift before you're let go to help people in crisis.
Right.
So thank you both for joining us. I want to make sure we get the phone number because we didn't get a chance at the last segment. The phone number for Victim Services, because people can call in if they've been, even if it's not the immediate crisis, but they are feeling some trauma from, they can still call in because there is some outreach work that's done for referrals that I've been a victim of crime. So we want to let people know the phone number that's on the screen now so that they can call in if they need help. A little later, we're going to encourage them to be volunteers as well. So Amy, you ride on a regular basis
That's right.
out on the street and are called by the police to come assist an emergency situation. Sounds pretty exciting. What got you to this point to do this as a profession?
Well, as a profession, I had chosen social work. And so in my second year of getting my master's in social work, I chose Victim Services as a field placement, which is an internship. And they sort of put you in an agency working full-time and getting a feel for that agency. And fortunately for me, it led to a position. And I originally was hired on as the intake counselor who does just a number of different kinds of cases in the office, and then moved out to crisis team about almost a year ago.
Okay, great. And John, how did you hear about Victim Services and let alone becoming an actual crisis team volunteer?
Well, I've done other volunteer work with the city, with the police department and so forth. And my first retirement was from law enforcement. And after law enforcement, I decided it would be nice to do things other than from an adversarial position. And I'll work the other side of the fence and help people instead of locking them up. So that's the reason I got interested in Victim Services.
That's great. I know there are lots of volunteers and always lots are needed across the city for all kinds of social service agencies. This one is unique. Describe for us, Amy, a little bit of a day in the life of just you report into work, and if you're going to drive the shift, what does that look like? Tell us, even tell us where you go and the car you get into and what you do, and do you always have a volunteer with you? Things like that.
Well, the goal is to always have a volunteer with us. I think the goal is to have two people riding at all times. And I think the reason for that is not only do we end up on some scenes where there may be 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 50 people, and it's just too much for one person, but it's also the emotional support. And John and I have actually worked together a lot, and it makes a difference if something emotionally touches you, which, you know, happens, to have somebody to process that with later. But you go to the substations, and there's 2 substations over the main, and like Kim was saying, we try to have 3 teams out in the evenings. So, for instance, one person would ride out of the north sub and cover the north sectors. Somebody else would, you know, drive out of the east sub and cover the central sectors. You go, you sign out all your equipment, you gotta get on the radio.
And your equipment, you have a radio that you carry with you?
Yeah,
a
it's
side
just
unit?
like on your belt.
And inside, as I think Kimberly mentioned in the earlier segment, you have the message, the mobile display screen, the computer that you can send messages to dispatch, or often other police officers send messages to you. And of course, you have the car. You're equipped, except for the law enforcement aspect. You're equipped with all the information tools necessary.
And that's important because often, you know, when you're going someplace, the more information you have before you get there, the more you can be thinking about, okay, what information can I take to help this victim? And so the earlier you can start thinking about what you might need to do when you get there.
Right.
So.
John writing as a volunteer, what are some of the first, do you remember on this side of the aspect of law enforcement and crises that you said you're going to help with now, just the one that's purely focused on a victim or survivor of a
Yeah.
trauma? Do you remember the first couple of major calls you went out on?
Yeah,
Or
we
what
went out
type?
on, I do remember several where we had to do a death notice to a family, and that's a very delicate process and pretty traumatic for the family, of course. And that's where the training of our staff member comes in. So we assist them in stuff like that. A lot of times you'll have numerous members of the family, so we help out with some of the others. Like she said, it takes two of us to handle the crowd sometimes.
Right. I think for people who haven't seen a situation where, could you describe a couple of other kinds of situations that you've been out on, not maybe particulars, but the type of situation that you've helped?
Sure. John mentioned something that is I think one of our hardest jobs is to make a death notification, and it is very delicate and it's very difficult to do. And so when you go there, there's all kinds of things to consider. And the hardest usually is children and children's relationship, and that's what is probably it's probably the hardest thing, at least for me to do. We do all other kinds of things: difficult traffic accidents, child abuse cases. There's so many. There's a lot of variety in what we do.
Right. I don't think many people can imagine what it's like to be the person that walks up the doorsteps to tell someone that whether it was an act of violence or an accident, to notify the family.
Yeah.
So police don't routinely do that. I know they're extremely busy on the scene, so is it just about always a person with victim services who does death notifications?
Well, we usually we go as a team, and we really try to take a team approach on almost all of our
Right.
calls, the police officer and with us together. Obviously serving different functions, but really working together to make sure that this person has the most information and everything. And it's extremely difficult to be that person, to be the bearer of bad news. But I think it's helpful to have a counselor there to provide information, because people feel lost, I think, sometimes with this information. Where do I go next?
Right.
What do I do? What's the process? Who do I tell? That kind of thing. And we can kind of walk them through it.
Right. That shows a lot of care for the public. I mean, there's an officer, a counselor, and a volunteer often that will go
Yeah.
on the site to let them know some very bad news,
Right.
and probably even help make phone calls if necessary, what that person needs.
You would do a lot
immediate
of stuff
response.
like that, right?
Wow. What would you say to encourage folks out there, John, to be a volunteer?
Well, it's a very rewarding job, I think, helping people in the time of trouble and so forth, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
It sounds extremely exciting. One of the team members that I rode with on an occasion said that we have the motivation to help others in need. I'm glad we have that instinct. But also, it's just amazingly exciting and almost surreal at times to imagine that you're on the scene of these accidents, but you're focused and you're trained to pick that person out who most needs the help
Yeah.
and focus on them, whether it's this tiny little child or someone who's very old and uncertain about all the confusion that's going on.
Right, and I think that brings up an excellent point. With all the chaos and the confusion and not knowing what's going on and with the trauma that's going on, we can be somebody that is stable and is calm and has information and makes a big difference. And you can't take away somebody's pain, and it doesn't really do them any good to try to do that. But just to be able to sit with somebody and allow them to feel it in a safer environment, I think, is our biggest role.
Right. It's a very specialized work, and
Yeah, it is.
the kind of counseling is very different from any other, whether it's from hospital chaplaincy to psychotherapy one-on-one to working in any other environment, because your environment is whatever the scene has to offer.
Right.
So it can be very dangerous. Well, I imagine in the confusion, you're very clearly identified with your
Yes.
name badge for victim services, but I bet you get the question, well, So are you the police too? What do you say to someone who's confused by that?
I say no. I'm a civilian counselor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they don't have to worry about an authority issue that sometimes, unfortunately, people have with police
Right.
officers. They can say that, so you're not a police officer, and I can relax here. Because even though the police are
Right.
there to serve, some people are unnerved by the sense of authority, even if they don't
Yeah.
have a guilty conscience. People look in their rearview mirror and they get nervous if they
The
notice one
lights.
of our police officers behind them. But serving in so many different ways is tremendous. We want people to call the same phone number if they're interested in volunteering, because there's more than one place to volunteer. You're with the crisis team, and I know there's going to be some more outreach work with volunteers.
Right.
And I believe I heard there's up to 90 volunteers on the list, but more are needed because there are shifts now around the clock, I believe, with crisis team, just about.
24 hours.
Yeah.
Just
Yes.
now, 24 hours. There's a crisis team out there,
Out there.
and we hope no one watching has terrible accidents or a victim of violence, but we know it does happen. Happens every day, and it's great to know you're out there very much, because I've learned a lot about victim services, and it's very impressive to see the level of quality and the care and the skills and also the camaraderie, because you've got to lean on one another.
A lot of
And-
that, right.
Yeah, definitely.
and as an officer, former law enforcement career, you know the stress on that side of
Oh,
the
yeah,
badge
right.
too.
There is
And
a lot of
so
stress for the police officers.
we should mention that the crisis team, there to support the public, but if there's an occasion to just check on officers and even firefighters or paramedics.
Yeah, right.
So how do you feel about that? I mean, I know the image of all police officers, male, female, young or older, to be able to handle everything, but I cannot imagine a much more stressful job. How do you feel about having this chance to have people
Well, I'm
for
enjoying it.
support?
Like I said, I'm no longer in the adversarial position with the public. I'm doing some good, helping them and being kind to them and doing nice things for them, we hope.
Good.
So I enjoy that part of it.
Well, that's great. Well, from my former career as a newspaper reporter, I always carried a scanner around. And now in Austin, when I carry this around,
Yes.
I hear victim services, crisis teams, and police officers, and know that people are being cared for in a very particular way. And that means a great deal. So thank you all. We thank Ann and Kimberly
I
as
enjoyed
well.
it very much.
Please join us again for Austin Faith Dialogue, where we learn more about how to care for Austin.